She took one look at Big Shaq and told him he didn't belong. When a powerful socialite tries to kick Big Shaq off his own private jet, she has no idea who she's messing with. As the truth explodes in front of the world, her past catches up with her. But what happens next will leave everyone speechless. Stay tuned, because this isn't just about one woman's downfall, it's about a fight much bigger than her. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Shaquille O'Neal, known to millions as Big Shaq, stepped onto the private airport tarmac, his broad frame casting a long shadow over the pavement. Dressed in a crisp, navy blue tracksuit and fresh white sneakers, he looked effortlessly cool, yet understated. His diamond-studded watch glinted in the sunlight, but his presence was what truly turned heads. Shaq wasn't just a legend on the court. He was a businessman, a philanthropist, a man who had built himself into an empire. But despite his success, he had never let the fame change him. He still laughed with strangers, still tipped waiters more than necessary, still lived by the principles his mother, Lucille, had instilled in him. Today, he was catching a flight for a series of meetings in Miami. His private jet, a sleek black Gulfstream G650, waited on the runway, its polished exterior reflecting the golden afternoon light. He had traveled this way countless times, but he still appreciated the quiet luxury of it, the ability to move on his own time, to stretch his long legs without being cramped into a commercial flight. As he entered the private terminal, the hum of quiet conversation and clinking coffee cups filled the space. A few other high-profile travelers lounged in the plush waiting area, but Shaq kept to himself, checking his phone for last-minute emails. That's when she walked in, Clarissa Montrose. Everything about her screamed old money. She wore a fitted white blazer over an expensive silk blouse, her blonde hair styled in a perfect wave that had likely taken hours to achieve. Large diamond earrings sparkled against her carefully bronzed skin, and her designer heels clicked sharply against the marble floor as she made her entrance. Shaq didn't know her, but he had seen her type before, entitled, powerful, and used to getting exactly what they wanted. Clarissa barely glanced at the other passengers, her nose slightly upturned as if she were already bored of being there. She walked straight to the counter, sliding a sleek black passport onto the desk. "I'm taking the Montrose jet to Palm Beach," she announced, her voice clipped and impatient. The receptionist nodded, typing quickly. "Of course, ma'am. Your pilot is preparing for takeoff. Please wait in the lounge and we'll call you when it's time to board." Clarissa sighed, already annoyed. She turned, scanning the room. That's when her eyes landed on Shaq. Her expression shifted instantly. She took in his tracksuit, his relaxed posture, the way he held himself with quiet confidence. And just like that, assumptions formed in her mind. Clarissa walked straight over, her heels clicking louder now. She didn't hesitate, didn't second-guess herself. She had grown up in a world where she never had to. "You there," she said sharply. "I need my bags taken to my jet. Quickly." Shaq, who had been scrolling through a text from his business manager, looked up slowly. He blinked. "Excuse me?" Clarissa pursed her lips, as if irritated that she had to repeat herself. "My luggage. Take it to my jet." Shaq raised an eyebrow. For a second, he thought she might be joking. But one look at her face told him otherwise. She had no idea who he was. And worse, she had already decided who he wasn't. A slow smile spread across Shaq's face. He leaned back slightly, resting an arm over the back of his chair. "You want me to carry your bags?" he asked, his voice light but laced with amusement. Clarissa huffed. "Isn't that your job?" A chuckle rumbled from Shaq's chest. "Lady, do I look like airport staff?" She crossed her arms. "I don't have time for this, just do what you're paid to do." Shaq exhaled slowly. He had dealt with ignorance before. This wasn't new. But something about the entitlement in her voice, the way she didn't even consider that she might be wrong, made his stomach twist. He could have corrected her right away, could have told her exactly who he was, shut her down with a few words. But something in him decided to wait. He wanted to see how far she'd take it. "You sure about that?" Shaq asked, tilting his head. Clarissa's jaw tightened. "You're wearing a tracksuit," she said, as if that was evidence enough. You're clearly not supposed to be here. Shaq let out another low chuckle. That's so? Clarissa turned, scanning the room. Her gaze landed on a security guard standing near the check-in counter. Excuse me, she called out. Can you come here, please? The guard, a middle-aged man in a pressed uniform, walked over, his expression neutral. Yes, ma'am? Clarissa pointed at Shaq. I don't feel comfortable with him in this lounge. He's obviously not a passenger, and I'd appreciate it if he were removed. Shaq let out a long, slow breath. There it was. The room had gone eerily quiet. A few passengers had stopped their conversations, sensing the tension. Some exchanged uncomfortable glances. Others pretended not to notice. The security guard hesitated. He recognized Shaq instantly. Who wouldn't? But Clarissa was powerful. Her family name carried weight, and the guard was caught between two forces he didn't want to upset. The guard shifted awkwardly. Ma'am, are you sure? Of course I'm sure, Clarissa snapped. Look at him. He doesn't belong here. Shaq finally stood. Slowly, deliberately. His full 7 feet 1 inch frame towering over Clarissa, casting a shadow over her petite figure. She blinked, stepping back slightly. Shaq pulled a boarding pass from his pocket and held it up. Funny thing, he said, voice smooth. This says I do. Clarissa's eyes flicked to the ticket in his hand. For the first time, she looked genuinely uncertain. The security guard cleared his throat. Mr. O'Neal is a confirmed passenger. The silence that followed was deafening. Shaq watched realization dawn on Clarissa's face. He could see the moment she understood exactly who she had just insulted. The color drained slightly from her cheeks. Her lips parted as if she wanted to say something, but pride kept her from backing down. Instead, she did what people like her always did when confronted with their own mistakes. She doubled down. There must be some mistake, she said quickly. That can't be his jet. Shaq let out a slow, amused breath. Oh, it's mine, all right. He took another step closer, lowering his voice just slightly. And guess what? He flashed a grin. I don't think you belong on it. Clarissa's face turned red. The security guard, now fully aware that he had made the wrong choice in hesitating, cleared his throat. Ma'am, if Mr. O'Neal is the aircraft owner, then I'm afraid… I'll have my lawyers handle this, she cut in, snatching up her purse. She spun on her heel and stormed away, her heels clicking furiously against the floor. Shaq shook his head, still smiling. He knew this wasn't over. People like her never let things go quietly, and he had a feeling this was just the beginning. A heavy silence settled over the private terminal after Clarissa Montrose stormed away. The passengers who had been watching the scene unfold quickly turned back to their phones, their newspapers, their overpriced coffee. Anything to avoid direct eye contact with Shaq. It was the kind of silence he knew well, the kind that followed an uncomfortable moment of truth. But Clarissa wasn't done yet. She had only made it a few steps before she spun back around, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Her face, once perfectly composed, was now flushed with irritation. No, with entitlement denied. You're lying, she blurted, voice sharp enough to slice through the quiet. There's absolutely no way that's your jet. Shaq exhaled slowly. He wasn't surprised. Some people couldn't accept the idea that a black man, not a rapper, not a musician, but a businessman, could own the very thing they felt entitled to. Clarissa turned to the security guard, her tone shifting into something more dangerous, something that carried weight. I want this verified, she demanded. Now. The security guard hesitated. He had already seen the boarding pass with Shaq's name printed on it, already confirmed that Shaquille O'Neal was very much a VIP passenger. But Clarissa was old money, the type of person whose family name still carried a disturbing amount of power. Shaq saw the hesitation in the guard's face, the split-second calculation of consequences. And that's when Clarissa did what he knew she would do. She got louder. I shouldn't even have to explain why this is ridiculous, she scoffed, voice rising enough that more heads started turning. Just look at him. This isn't his world. Men like him don't belong in places like this. The words landed like a slap, sharp and stinging, though Shaq didn't flinch. He'd heard it before. In high school, when a coach had once said he'd never be smart enough for college. In the NBA, when critics questioned whether he was too much of a showman to be taken seriously. In boardrooms, where executives with half his intelligence still expected him to play the role of a silent partner. He had spent his entire life proving people wrong. And yet, it never ended. Clarissa stood there, chest rising and falling as if waiting for applause, as if expecting nods of agreement. Instead, all she got was Shaq's silence. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out his boarding pass, and held it up between two fingers. For a moment, no one moved. Then the security guard finally took it, eyes scanning the name. His Adam's apple bobbed in a nervous gulp. He knew what this meant. Shaquille O'Neal. A household name. A business mogul. A billionaire. The room felt heavier now, filled with an awkward, choking tension. Passengers exchanged glances. Some of them had recognized Shaq from the moment he walked in, but had stayed quiet, watching how it played out. Others were only now putting the pieces together, their curiosity morphing into embarrassment. Clarissa, however, refused to back down. "This must be a mistake," she scoffed, folding her arms. "Maybe the jet was chartered in his name, but it can't actually belong to him." Shaq let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Lady," he said, voice smooth. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" Clarissa ignored him, looking back at the security guard expectantly, waiting for him to fix this for her. The guard hesitated again, and that hesitation was all Shaq needed to see. It didn't matter how rich he was. It didn't matter how famous, how successful, how respected. In that moment, in this airport, he was still the one being questioned. The realization hit deep, but not with surprise. No, Shaq had known this reality his whole life. What stung, what always stung, was that he had never escaped it. For all his achievements, all the doors he had forced open with his own hands, people like Clarissa Montrose still saw him as out of place. Not because of what he wore, not because of how he carried himself, but because of something he couldn't change, something he shouldn't have to change. His skin. He felt it in the way the guard kept second-guessing himself, despite holding the proof in his hands. Felt it in the way the other passengers remained silent, their discomfort more important than speaking up. Felt it in the way Clarissa still believed, even now, that she was right. But Shaq wasn't about to let her control the moment. Still calm, still composed, he turned away from the security guard and stepped toward the private terminal's concierge desk. The receptionist, a woman in a sleek uniform, looked nervous. She had been watching everything. Shaq rested a massive hand on the counter, his voice easy but firm. "Hey, can you do me a favor?" The woman swallowed. Yes, sir?" He nodded toward the window where his private jet still sat waiting on the tarmac, sleek and undeniable. "Tell my pilot I'll be boarding in 5. The receptionist blinked. Then, without hesitation, she picked up the phone. "Of course," Mr. O'Neal. Shaq turned back to Clarissa, whose expression had finally started to crumble. "You can keep talking," he said casually. "Or you can get out of my way." For the first time since the confrontation started, Clarissa Montrose had no words. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Her cheeks flushed deeper, the reality settling in. She had lost. And worse, everyone had watched her lose. Shaq grabbed his carry-on bag and moved toward the glass doors leading to the runway, his pace unhurried, completely unbothered. The last thing he heard before stepping onto the tarmac was a hushed murmur from one of the passengers behind him. "I can't believe she just did that to Shaq." The doors closed behind him, shutting out the murmurs, the whispers, the embarrassment that didn't belong to him. The sun was blindingly bright as he walked toward his jet, his home in the skies, the thing they said he could never have. And as he climbed the stairs, stepping inside, he didn't look back. The doors to the runway had barely closed behind Shaq when a sharp voice cut through the murmurs in the lounge. "This isn't over." Clarissa Montrose stood rooted in place, her posture stiff, her jaw clenched. She wasn't used to losing, and she certainly wasn't about to start now. Passengers in the lounge watched cautiously, their gazes flicking between her and the security guard still gripping Shaq's boarding pass like it was a live grenade. Some travelers reached for their phones, pretending not to listen, while others held them up, discreetly recording. Clarissa's eyes flashed with irritation. She had grown up in a world where wealth meant never having to be questioned. A world where she could snap her fingers and make problems disappear. And right now, Shaquille O'Neal was a problem. "I want him stopped before he boards that plane," she demanded, turning back to the security guard. "There's been a mix-up. He has to be confused." The guard shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, his name is on the passenger list." Clarissa scoffed. "And you think that's proof? Do you even know who I am?" She stepped closer, lowering her voice, her expression sharpening. "I donate to this airport. My family has had membership here for generations. Do you really want to risk your job over this?" The guard hesitated. Shaq, standing just outside on the tarmac, took a slow breath as he watched the scene unfold through the glass. Here we go. He could feel it happening. The shift. The way privilege didn't need to shout when it could whisper threats instead. For a moment, he considered ignoring it, walking up those steps and letting the whole thing fade in his rear view. But something inside him, something deeper than pride, deeper than anger, told him to wait. He turned back around. Clarissa was still in the middle of her tantrum in designer heels when the doors opened, and Shaq walked back inside. The room tensed again, Clarissa's face twisted in frustration. "Oh, you again." Shaq exhaled, slow and measured. "Me again." She folded her arms. "Look, I don't know what kind of scam you're running, but it ends here." She shot a glance at the security guard. "I don't believe for 1 second that man owns a private jet." Shaq's lips curved into something almost amused. "Oh?" Clarissa smirked, thinking she had the upper hand. "You expect me to believe you, dressed like that, own a multi-million-dollar aircraft?" Shaq let out a low chuckle. "Lady, I could buy 10. She rolled her eyes. "That's what all you people say." A thick, uncomfortable silence followed. The kind that made people shift in their seats, suddenly unsure of where to look. Shaq tilted his head. Ah, so that's how far she was willing to take it. There were 2 ways this could go. He could pull out his credentials, flex his wealth, crush her with a single phone call. Or he could handle it his way. Shaq reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and smirked. "All right," he said, tapping his screen. "Let's clear this up." Clarissa's arms tightened across her chest. "Who are you calling?" Shaq didn't answer. He simply pressed the phone to his ear and waited. It rang once before a clipped professional voice answered. "Mr. O'Neal, how can I assist you?" Shaq kept his gaze locked on Clarissa as he spoke. "Hey, Richard, you at the airport today?" There was a slight pause. Then, "Yes, sir. I'm in my office. Do you need me to come down?" Shaq's smile deepened. "Yeah, I think you should." Clarissa frowned. "Who was that?" Shaq tucked his phone away. "You'll see." The next few minutes were thick with tension. Clarissa shifted on her feet, trying to hold on to her false confidence, but there was a nervous flicker in her gaze now. The security guard wouldn't meet her eyes anymore. A few passengers, still recording, whispered to each other. Then, the doors at the end of the lounge swung open. A man in an expensive navy suit strode in, his face pale, his movements brisk. His gold nameplate glinted under the overhead lights. Richard Lawson, airport director. Clarissa straightened, relief flashing across her features. Finally, someone who can fix this ridiculous mistake. Richard didn't acknowledge her. His eyes went straight to Shaq. "Mr. O'Neal," he said quickly, his voice tight with urgency. "Is there a problem?" Clarissa blinked. Shaq's gaze never wavered. "You tell me." Richard swallowed, his jaw tightening as he finally took in the scene. The security guard's uncertainty, the passengers watching, the quiet phone cameras capturing every second. Then, reluctantly, he turned to Clarissa. "Ma'am," he said, carefully measured. "Is there a reason you're questioning Mr. O'Neal's right to be here?" Clarissa faltered. For the first time, her confidence cracked. I just thought..." She gestured toward Shaq, but her words failed her. Shaq lifted a brow. "Go on." Clarissa's lips pressed into a thin line. "You have to admit," she finally said, forcing a laugh. "This looks unusual." The weight of everyone's eyes bore down on her now. Richard cleared his throat. Mr. O'Neal is a distinguished guest at this airport. His name is in our top-tier database. He's owned private aircraft for over a decade. Clarissa's mouth opened, then closed. She was scrambling now. I never said he wasn't allowed here, she backpedaled. I was just making sure everything was in order. Shaq's smile didn't reach his eyes. Making sure I was in order. Clarissa flushed. Oh, don't start twisting my words. Shaq let out a slow breath. He had seen this tactic before. Deflect, deny, gaslight, and it wasn't going to work. You called security on me, he reminded her. You questioned my identity. You told everyone here that men like me don't belong. He tilted his head. So what exactly was your point? Clarissa bristled. I was looking out for security reasons. A few scoffs echoed around the lounge. Someone muttered, yeah, okay. The public tide had shifted, and Clarissa knew it. Her fingers clenched around the strap of her designer handbag. This is ridiculous. I was just being cautious. Richard inhaled sharply. Ma'am, perhaps you should... Oh, don't you dare lecture me, Clarissa snapped. Do you have any idea who I am? The airport director's face hardened. His voice, once neutral, turned clipped. Yes, he said. And do you have any idea who he is? Clarissa's face turned scarlet. The room was dead silent now. Shaq watched the realization hit her like a tidal wave. She had lost control of the narrative. And now? She was the one who didn't belong. He could have pushed harder, could have made her squirm a little more, but he didn't need to. She had done that to herself. With one last furious glare, Clarissa grabbed her purse and stormed out. The moment the doors shut behind her, someone let out a low whistle. Man, that was brutal, a voice murmured. Shaq just shook his head, grabbing his bag again. He turned to Richard, who still looked somewhat terrified. Thanks for coming down, Shaq said easily. Guess I'll head out now. Richard exhaled in relief. Yes, sir. Safe travels. Shaq nodded. Then before stepping onto the tarmac, he looked over his shoulder, locking eyes with one of the passengers still recording. Make sure you get my good side, he said, smirking. And then he walked away. Because unlike Clarissa Montrose, he belonged everywhere. Shaq had already left the airport, settled into the plush leather seat of his private jet, when the storm he didn't see coming started brewing. His phone buzzed on the armrest, but he ignored it. A business email, maybe a reminder about his next meeting. He'd get to it later. Right now, he just wanted a moment of peace. But the world had other plans. Somewhere in the depths of social media, a video was spreading like wildfire. It started small. A 32-second clip, shaky but clear, uploaded by a passenger who had been in the lounge. The caption read, entitled, Karen tries to kick Shaq off his own private jet. This is insane. At first, it was just a few retweets, a handful of comments, people tagging their friends. Then, it caught fire. Shaq's face filled the screens of millions, his towering frame standing in quiet defiance as Clarissa Montrose humiliated herself in front of an audience that only grew by the second. Her words echoed over and over. Men like you don't belong in places like this. The internet didn't like that. By the time Shaq's plane touched down in Miami, the video had millions of views. It had made its way onto Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. On YouTube, commentary channels were already dissecting the interaction, calling it an example of racial bias in elite spaces. Celebrities started weighing in. A well-known rapper tweeted, "Ain't no way someone tried to Karen Shaq. The audacity." A best-selling author posted, "This is what we mean when we say it never stops." Shaq is a billionaire, a legend, and still they don't see him as worthy. Athletes, actors, influencers, everyone was talking about it. And yet, Shaq said nothing. Back at his Miami hotel, his phone was buzzing nonstop. His team had already sent texts urging him to release a statement. His PR manager had left 2 voicemails, both urgent. He ignored them all. Because this wasn't new to him. He had lived this reality long before cameras were rolling. The airport incident wasn't a shocking moment in his life. It was a reminder of what he had always known. It didn't matter that he had spent decades proving himself. It didn't matter that he had money, power, or influence. To some people, he would always be questioned, and right now he didn't want to talk about it. Meanwhile, Clarissa Montrose was learning what it felt like to be on the other side of power. Her emails started going unanswered. Her phone calls weren't being returned. The brands that once proudly aligned with her, luxury fashion houses, exclusive event sponsors, high-end travel agencies, were now scrubbing their association clean. One by one, they released quiet, carefully worded statements. We do not condone discrimination in any form. We believe in equality and inclusion. Our partnership with Ms. Montrose has officially ended. Her name, once a golden ticket into elite circles, was becoming a liability. And for the first time in her life, money wasn't fixing it. The news cycle picked up speed. Morning shows debated it. Late-night hosts made jokes about it. News anchors, speaking in carefully measured tones, called it a stark reminder of the racial biases still present in high society. And yet, Clarissa still refused to apologize. Instead, she tried to fight back. She called the video misleading. She claimed she was being unfairly attacked. She insisted she was just concerned about security. But the internet wasn't buying it. People dug deeper. Old interviews surfaced. Offhand comments, subtle dismissals, condescending remarks, all painting a picture of a woman who had never believed people like Shaq belonged in her world. And then, the final blow landed. A former employee came forward, a woman who had worked for Clarissa for 4 years. And her story wasn't pretty. In an exclusive interview, the woman, Sarah Klein, spoke carefully, her voice calm but firm. I wish I could say I was surprised by that video, she said, but I'm not. She went on to describe the years of microaggressions, the way Clarissa treated her black and minority staff differently, how she once told Sarah, it's important to make sure people know their place. The news ran with it. Now it wasn't just about the airport incident. It was about who Clarissa Montrose had always been. And suddenly, she wasn't just losing deals and partnerships, she was losing everything. Shaq sat in his Miami suite, watching it all unfold on the massive flat-screen TV. He took a slow sip of his drink. He should have felt satisfied, should have enjoyed watching karma do its thing. But instead, he just felt tired. He had never wanted it to become this. This wasn't about destroying Clarissa Montrose. It was about something bigger, something that had existed long before she called security on him. His phone buzzed again. This time he answered. Shaq. His PR manager sounded out of breath. We need to talk about your statement. Shaq rubbed his temple. I wasn't planning on making one. The pause on the other end was long. Then, you might not have a choice. Because some fights you walk away from, and some fights find you, no matter what. Clarissa Montrose had always believed in the power of influence, the right connections, the right branding, the right damage control. But for the first time in her life, none of it was working. Her team had been scrambling for days, running crisis PR strategies, setting up closed-door meetings, trying desperately to put a lid on something that refused to be contained. The video had gone too far. The backlash was too loud. Brands had cut ties. Invitations to exclusive events had quietly disappeared. Even some of the people in her inner circle, the same ones who had always supported her no matter what, had stopped returning her calls. She wasn't just losing business deals, she was losing power, and she couldn't stand it. That's why, on a crisp Wednesday morning, a carefully worded statement appeared on her Instagram account. A white backgrounded text post in a neutral font, designed to look apologetic. The caption read, To those I may have offended, I'd like to say, click. Millions tapped in. And just like that, the world read her so-called apology. I want to take a moment to address the situation that has unfolded over the past few days. First and foremost, I am deeply sorry if my words or actions were misinterpreted in any way. It was never my intention to offend or make anyone feel unwelcome. I was simply confused in the moment. With heightened security concerns in today's world, I reacted in what I thought was a responsible way. Unfortunately, it was taken out of context. To Mr. O'Neal, I extend my sincerest apologies for any misunderstanding. I have the utmost respect for you and your contributions to the world of sports and business. I hope we can all learn from this and move forward with kindness. The moment the statement dropped, The comments came pouring in. Did she just say, misinterpreted? Classic non-apology. Blame everyone else, never yourself. Calling it now. She didn't write this herself. With today's security concerns? So, she's saying Shaq was a threat? Ma'am, sit down. Within minutes, Twitter was ablaze. Screenshots of her post were circulating with red-marked annotations, pointing out every insincere phrase, every deflection, every subtle refusal to take accountability. A popular late-night show host even mocked it on air. You know an apology is bad when it starts with, if my words were misinterpreted. That's like saying, I'm sorry you got mad at me for slapping you. Even the people who normally defended her, the upper-class elite who prided themselves on their exclusivity, began to distance themselves. Because if there's one thing the rich hate more than a scandal, it's a scandal that refuses to die. Clarissa Montrose wasn't a protected name anymore. She was a liability. And Shaq? Shaq wasn't even saying a word. Shaq had never been the type to chase controversy. He didn't like drama, didn't care for social media fights. But after Clarissa's so-called apology, his phone started blowing up in a different way. His DM inbox flooded, not just with support, but with stories. From fans, from strangers, from people who had experienced exactly what he had experienced at the airport. A college student wrote, I had a professor assume I was a janitor because I was wearing a hoodie. This happens all the time, and people like Clarissa just prove it. A black businessman messaged, I've been mistaken for the valet at my own office building. You handled that situation better than I ever could have. A former pro athlete shared, people don't get it. You can have all the money in the world, all the success, and they still look at you like you don't belong. Hundreds of messages, thousands of stories. Shaq sat in his Miami hotel room, phone in his hand, scrolling through them all. And something deep inside him shifted. Because this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been made to feel like an outsider in their own world. Clarissa's racism wasn't unique. It was just louder than usual. And now, the world had seen it for what it was. His team wanted him to respond. To issue his own statement. To capitalize on the moment. To call out Clarissa directly and use his voice to shut her down for good. But Shaq didn't care about winning the internet. He wasn't interested in destroying her. What he did care about was the conversation this had started. The bigger issue. The real fight. How people, black men in particular, could be millionaires, legends, business moguls, and still be treated like they didn't belong. This wasn't just about a private jet lounge. It was about every boardroom, every gated community, every high-end event where people like him were still second-guessed. He rubbed his temple, letting out a slow breath. Then, finally, he picked up his phone and called the one person he knew would give him the realest answer. His mother. She picked up after the first ring. Shaquille. Ma. You sound tired. Shaq let out a small chuckle. I am. Lucille sighed. This about that video? You saw it? Boy, the whole country saw it. I bet even your grandma in heaven saw it. Shaq leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. I don't know what to do, Ma. Lucille was quiet for a moment. Then, you already know what to do. Shaq frowned. I do. You always knew. You just needed to hear it. Shaq exhaled. She was right. He knew exactly what he had to do, and it wasn't about Clarissa Montrose at all. That night, Shaq finally broke his silence, but he didn't release a statement about Clarissa. He didn't mention her name at all. Instead, he posted something simple, but powerful. A black and white photo of himself at 14 years old. A young kid with big dreams and even bigger obstacles. And the caption? They told me I didn't belong. I told them to watch me. The internet went wild, because Shaq wasn't just fighting back. He was making a statement that would last longer than any controversy ever could. Clarissa Montrose had spent her entire life untouchable. Born into generational wealth, she had never once worried about consequences. Her last name alone opened doors. Her presence at any event was a signal of exclusivity, and her network of powerful friends ensured that she always landed on her feet. But in less than a week, everything had changed. The incident with Shaq had been the spark. The viral video, the backlash, the disastrous non-apology. It had all been bad. But what came next? That was catastrophic. The internet was relentless. When people started digging into Clarissa's past, it didn't take long before the cracks in her perfect image began to show. A business journalist published an exposé unearthing a history of shady deals linked to the Montrose name. Charities started by her family mysteriously shutting down after large donations disappeared. Montrose investments funding questionable projects that led to the forced eviction of lower-income communities. Lawsuits buried under NDAs, all quietly settled out of court. What was once a respected legacy was now a glaring spotlight of corruption. And then came the employees. The first to speak out was Madeline Carter, a former executive assistant at Montrose Enterprises. She had worked for Clarissa directly for 5 years. And her experiences? Horrifying. She didn't just describe a boss who was demanding, she described a woman who was cruel, demeaning, and deeply prejudiced. I remember once she told me I needed to hire a different kind of receptionist, Madeline recalled in an exclusive interview. I asked her what she meant and she said, someone who fits the brand better, someone lighter. The interviewer's voice sharpened. She was talking about race? Madeline nodded without hesitation. She always found ways to say it without saying it. But we all knew. Once Madeline spoke, others followed. A former chauffeur described how Clarissa once refused to get into a car because the driver was black. A Montrose investments analyst recalled her habit of dismissing pitches from minority-led firms, calling them unpolished. A former housekeeper detailed the difference in treatment, how the white staff were given lighter workloads, while Black and Latino employees were underpaid, overworked, and constantly belittled. And then, the videos surfaced. Someone, a former friend turned enemy perhaps, had been saving receipts. Clips of Clarissa at parties, at events, off the record, where she had let her guard down, unaware that the camera was rolling. A 2017 dinner party, where she could be heard mocking the idea of diversity hires, calling them charity cases. A 2019 private yacht gathering, where she told a story about mistaking a black guest for a waiter, and laughed about it. A fundraiser in 2021, where she leaned over to a friend and muttered, "They only invited him so they wouldn't look racist." Her voice was clear. Her words were undeniable. This wasn't just one bad day at an airport. This was who she had always been. And now, the world knew it. By the time her business partners started jumping ship, Clarissa Montrose was already sinking. Montrose Luxury Resorts released a statement distancing itself from her. An upcoming fashion line collaboration dropped her overnight. Her real estate ventures lost millions in investor pullouts. And the biggest blow? Her family. The Montrose name had been built on exclusivity and control. They had survived scandals before, but never one that dragged their fortune into it. And so, in a move of pure survival, Clarissa's own relatives began pushing her out. The board of Montrose Enterprises called an emergency meeting. By the end of the day, she had been officially removed as CEO. Clarissa Montrose, once a queen in high society, was now a cautionary tale. While the internet celebrated her downfall, Shaq remained quiet. Not because he didn't care, but because he was focused on something bigger. This wasn't about one woman's disgrace. This was about a system that had allowed her to thrive in the first place. Shaq had spent his entire life working twice as hard to be taken seriously. Now, he wanted to make sure the next generation wouldn't have to. And so, instead of posting about Clarissa, he posted something else. A black and white photo of him as a rookie in the NBA, standing in a suit that didn't quite fit, nervous but determined. The caption, "When they don't want you at the table, build your own." That post, it got more engagement than Clarissa's entire scandal. And the next day, he announced a new initiative, a multi-million-dollar fund dedicated to supporting Black and minority entrepreneurs in business, tech, and real estate. Opportunities for those who had been shut out. Doors opening where they had once been locked. And that, not the downfall of Clarissa Montrose, became the real story. Because Shaq had never been interested in revenge. He had always been focused on legacy. And now, he was building something that would last far longer than any scandal ever could. Shaq had never been the type to seek revenge. That wasn't how he was raised. His mother, Lucille, had always told him, "You don't fight ignorance with anger, you fight it with action." And now, as the media storm surrounding Clarissa Montrose reached a fever pitch, he knew that his response had to be bigger than her downfall. This wasn't about one woman's ignorance. It was about a reality that black men, no matter how rich, famous, or powerful, still faced every day. So instead of dragging Clarissa through the mud, Shaq did what he did best. He led by example. On a quiet Sunday morning, Shaq finally broke his silence. No flashy press release, no PR-crafted apology tour. Just him. A simple video posted to his social media where he sat in a chair. No suit, no branding, no distractions. Just his voice and the truth. He looked straight into the camera and began speaking. "I've been a millionaire. I've been a champion. I've been a businessman, a philanthropist, a mentor. But before all of that, I was just a kid. A black kid who grew up hearing the same thing over and over. You don't belong here. I heard it on the basketball court when people told me I was too big, too slow to make it. I heard it in college when they said I wasn't smart enough to get a degree. I heard it in boardrooms when men in suits told me to just stick to basketball. And last week, I heard it again. Standing in a private jet lounge, being told that a plane with my name on it couldn't be mine. You see, money doesn't erase racism. Success doesn't erase racism. Respect doesn't erase racism. It just gets quieter. It gets disguised as concern. It gets masked as confusion. It hides behind words like misunderstanding. But make no mistake, it's still there. And I'm tired. Not just for myself, but for every person who has been told, directly or indirectly, that they don't belong. That's why I'm not here to talk about Clarissa Montrose. She's not the point. The point is that this happens every single day, to people who don't have cameras recording, to people who don't have the privilege of walking away. So instead of spending my energy on anger, I'm putting it into action. Today, I'm announcing the launch of the Belonging Initiative, a program dedicated to breaking down barriers in industries where black and underprivileged communities have been historically shut out. We're starting with private aviation, where less than 2% of pilots, executives, and owners are black. We're going to change that. We're going into business and tech, where access to capital and opportunities are still limited for people of color. We're going to change that. We're making sure that when the next generation walks into spaces that were never built for them, they won't have to fight to prove they belong. Because we do belong. And it's time the world catches up. Within minutes, the video had millions of views. Within hours, it was everywhere. Major news outlets aired it in full. Celebrities reposted it. Business leaders, athletes, and activists applauded not just his words, but his decision to turn the moment into a movement. The response was overwhelming. Instead of focusing on Clarissa Montrose, the world was talking about change. Black pilots and flight attendants began sharing their experiences about the lack of diversity in aviation. Entrepreneurs posted about the struggles of breaking into industries dominated by generational wealth. College students spoke up about professors who underestimated them, mentors who overlooked them, doors that had been closed before they even knocked. Shaq's words had tapped into something much bigger than an airport incident. They had sparked a national conversation about access, privilege, and the silent walls that still stood in elite spaces. As the world rallied around Shaq's message, Clarissa Montrose's world continued to crumble. The Montrose name, once synonymous with power and wealth, had become radioactive. Investors were pulling out of her projects. Luxury brands refused to associate with her. Her invitations to high-profile events quietly disappeared. Even those who had once defended her were now stepping away, realizing that her presence was a liability. And then, with nowhere left to turn, she reached out to Shaq. Shaq's manager picked up the call first. "It's Clarissa Montrose," she said, her voice less confident than usual. "I'd like to meet with Shaquille privately." The request made its way to Shaq, but he wasn't surprised. He had seen this pattern before. People like Clarissa didn't apologize until they had no other choice, until they had something to lose. And yet, Shaq found himself wondering, would she actually take responsibility? Or was this just another way to save herself? He let the question sit for a moment before giving his answer. "Tell her I'll meet," he said. on one condition. His manager raised an eyebrow. And what's that? Shaq leaned forward, his voice steady. She has to do it on camera. The manager blinked. You're serious? Shaq nodded. If she really wants to own up to what she did, he said, she won't be afraid to do it where the world can see. The request was sent. The message was clear. If Clarissa Montrose wanted redemption, she'd have to earn it. Not with empty words, not with another rehearsed PR statement, but with real accountability. Now the question was, would she take it, or would she do what she had always done? Run. The private meeting was set. No cameras, no press, no scripted statements. Just Shaq and Clarissa Montrose, face to face. She had insisted on a closed-door conversation, away from the public eye, away from the backlash that had swallowed her whole. Shaq had agreed, but not for revenge. He didn't care about watching her squirm. He didn't need an apology. What he wanted, what he needed, was an answer. Why? Why had she looked at him? A man who had built himself from the ground up, a man who had earned his seat at any table, and still decided that he didn't belong. He intended to find out. The conference room at the hotel was quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed against the walls. Clarissa Montrose sat at the table, her posture stiff, hands clasped in front of her. She looked different than she had a week ago. Her confidence was gone. The designer clothes were still there, the perfectly styled hair, the diamond earrings, but the arrogance that had once clung to her like expensive perfume, that was missing. When Shaq stepped in, she flinched, as if bracing herself. He sat across from her, leaning back in his chair, arms crossed over his chest. He didn't say a word. The tension stretched between them. Finally, Clarissa cleared her throat. Thank you for meeting me. Shaq nodded once. Let's talk. She exhaled sharply, as if she had rehearsed this moment 100 times and still didn't know where to start. I want to explain, she said carefully. Shaq raised an eyebrow. Explain what? She swallowed. Everything, the way things escalated, the way it looked. It wasn't what I meant. Shaq remained silent. Clarissa shifted in her seat. I wasn't being racist, Shaquille, she insisted. I was just confused. Shaq held up a hand. Stop, he said, voice calm but firm. Let's be real for a second. Clarissa froze. Shaq leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. I don't want your PR version of what happened, he said. I don't want excuses. I want the truth. Clarissa hesitated. Shaq's voice didn't waver. Why did you really think I didn't belong? The question hung in the air. Clarissa's carefully controlled expression flickered. For a second, she looked like she wanted to run. Then finally, she said something real. I don't know, she whispered. Shaq tilted his head. Yeah, you do. She clenched her jaw, looking away. I grew up in a world where people like you weren't in places like that, she admitted, voice quieter now. Where men in tracksuits didn't own private jets. Where? She stopped herself. Shaq didn't blink. Where black men didn't own private jets. Clarissa inhaled sharply, but she didn't deny it. The silence that followed was thick. Shaq let her words settle, let her sit with the weight of them. You looked at me, he said slowly, and decided I was an outsider before you even knew who I was. Clarissa swallowed hard. That's not, isn't it? She fell silent, because it was. Clarissa Montrose had never been questioned like this before. She had lived her entire life in a bubble where privilege excused ignorance. But here, in this room, there was nowhere to hide. For the first time, she was face to face with her own bias, and it terrified her. Her voice shook slightly when she spoke again. I think, she hesitated, choosing her words carefully. I think I was raised to see people like you as different. Shaq let out a slow breath. There it was. The truth, raw and exposed. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't intentional malice. It was a lifetime of conditioning. And now she was realizing, for the first time, that the world she had been taught to believe in was a lie. Clarissa's eyes flickered up to meet Shaq's. For the first time since the meeting started, There was something in them that hadn't been there before. Doubt. Not doubt in him. Doubt in herself. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Do you think I can change?" Shaq studied her carefully. He had spent his entire life dealing with people like Clarissa, people who didn't see the problem until it affected them directly. Some changed, some didn't. So he gave her the only answer he could. "I think that's up to you." Clarissa nodded slowly, staring down at her hands. When she finally looked up again, she wasn't the same woman who had called security on him at the airport. Maybe she wasn't fully changed. Maybe she never would be. But for the first time, she wasn't running from the truth. For the first time, she was willing to face it. She reached for her bag, pulling out a folded piece of paper. Shaq watched as she slid it across the table. "What's this?" he asked. Clarissa took a shaky breath. "My real apology," she said. Shaq didn't reach for it, not yet. Instead, he met her gaze, searching for something. Something real. And when he finally took the letter, she whispered something he hadn't expected to hear. "Thank you. Not for forgiving her, not for meeting her, but for forcing her to see what she had spent her whole life ignoring." Shaq nodded, standing up from the table. The conversation was over. The rest? That was up to her. The media storm that had surrounded Shaq and Clarissa Montrose for weeks had finally settled. Headlines moved on to the next scandal. Social media found new controversies to debate. But Shaq hadn't moved on, because this was never just about one viral moment. While the world was busy celebrating Clarissa's downfall, Shaq stayed focused on his mission, creating real opportunities for people who had been denied access to elite spaces for far too long. He expanded the Belonging Initiative, pouring resources into programs that helped underrepresented communities enter industries like private aviation, tech, and finance. New scholarships, new mentorships, new funding for Black-owned businesses. And as the months passed, Shaq watched as real doors started opening. But then, something unexpected happened. One evening, as Shaq sat in his Miami office reviewing plans for an upcoming business venture, his phone buzzed with a new email notification. He glanced at the sender. Clarissa Montrose. For a long moment, he just stared at it. They hadn't spoken since their closed-door meeting months ago. He had left her with the truth, left her to face her own reflection. He hadn't expected to hear from her again. And yet, here she was. He opened the email. Subject: an invitation and a step forward. "Shaquille, I know I'm the last person you expected to hear from. But after our conversation, I realized that I had two choices: walk away from my mistakes or do something about them. I chose the second. For the past few months, I've been working with the Bridges Project, an anti-racism organization that focuses on breaking down systemic barriers in elite spaces. We're hosting our annual event in Atlanta next month, and we're focusing on the intersection of privilege, power, and responsibility. I'm asking you, not as a favor, not as an apology, but as someone who has taught me more than I was ever willing to learn before. Would you be willing to be our keynote speaker? I won't take it personally if you decline, but I hope you'll consider it." Clarissa Shaq leaned back in his chair, processing. He wasn't angry. He wasn't amused. What he felt was something harder to define. Could people like Clarissa really change? Not just say they changed, not just rebrand themselves to survive, but actually face who they had been and choose to be different? For a long time, Shaq had believed that some people never would. But then he thought about his mother's words. People don't change because you tell them to. They change when they decide to. Maybe Clarissa had decided to. Maybe she hadn't. There was only one way to find out. Shaq exhaled, then typed his response. "I'll be there." A month later, Shaq walked onto the stage of a packed auditorium in Atlanta, Georgia. The room was filled with activists, business leaders, students, and politicians, all gathered to discuss the future of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And in the front row, Clarissa Montrose. She wasn't the center of attention anymore. She wasn't speaking. She was just watching, listening, learning. Shaq stood at the podium, the weight of everything that had led to this moment pressing against him. He took a breath, then spoke. "A few months ago, I was told I didn't belong. Not for the first time, not for the last. But here's the thing. I didn't need permission to belong. None of us do. The problem isn't that we don't belong. It's that some people have been told for so long that they own the space. They start to believe it. And when someone like me walks in, they panic. Not because we don't deserve to be there, but because they were never taught to see us as equals. I used to think people like that never changed. Maybe most don't, but maybe some do. And maybe that's what matters, not punishing the past, but building a future where this doesn't happen again, where no kid grows up being told they have to work twice as hard just to be seen as enough, where no one walks into a room and is immediately questioned for being there. We're not asking for a seat at the table, we're building our own. The room erupted into applause. Shaq glanced toward Clarissa. She didn't speak. She didn't wave. She just nodded. Maybe it was real growth. Maybe it wasn't. But in the end, that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was what came next. The fight for equality isn't just Shaq's story. It's all of ours. Every day, people face silent barriers in spaces they've earned the right to be in. It's time to change that. Support organizations that break down systemic bias, uplift underrepresented voices, and create real opportunities. Join the movement, because true belonging isn't given, it's built.